Hey everyone, welcome. Tonight, we're diving into the surprisingly mind-bending realm of ancient Egyptian recreational chemistry. This civilization, the one that brought us the pyramids, mummies, and apparently festivals that could give your college roommates' worst nights a run for their money. Before you get too comfortable, take a quick second to like this video and subscribe if you're actually enjoying what I do here. Also, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always cool to see who's tuning in from all corners of the globe. Okay, now, dim the lights, maybe switch on a fan for that low background noise, and let's gently ease into tonight's adventure together. Let's kick things off with the ancient Egyptians' most iconic botanical party trick, the blue lotus flower. You've probably spotted it in tomb paintings, those elegant petals, usually being sniffed by pharaohs or casually waved around at banquets like some ancient version of clinking glasses. But this flower wasn't just for decoration. The Egyptians thought it had sacred powers, along with some mild psychoactive effects. That's right, the blue lotus could get you just a tad bit floaty. The method was pretty simple. You'd take the dried petals and let them soak in wine for a while, sometimes for days. Then you'd drink the resulting infusion at festivals, ceremonies, or, whenever you felt like tuning out the sound of 200 people chanting hymns at full blast. The effect was a gentle, dreamy euphoria. Not enough to make you forget your own name, but just enough to make building a pyramid sound like a fun group project. Now, let's be clear, the Egyptians didn't call it getting high. They called it communing with the gods. The blue lotus was strongly linked to rebirth and the sun god Ra, which made it perfect for temple rituals and funerary rites. Holding the flower up to your nose was a symbolic way of inhaling divinity. Priests and priestesses alike were trained to host gods like Airbnb guests, welcoming them into their bodies during rituals. This included changes in voice, posture, and a sudden urge to announce cryptic things while staring into a fire. In many temples, it was just another Wednesday. To outsiders, it may have looked like a mass fainting spell. But within the temple, this was how messages from the gods were delivered. Sometimes the gods advised, sometimes they scolded. Sometimes they demanded more cake offerings, which says a lot about ancient theology and ancient appetites. The trance wasn't always voluntary, either. There are accounts of the afflicted being taken by deities, often accompanied by shouting, shaking, and suspicious amounts of incense. Whether these were actual divine messages or simply what happens when you inhale 4 hours of kiffy smoke next to a flaming brazier is still debated. Of course, once the trance ended, the possessed party returned to normal, often looking slightly disoriented and very sweaty. The ritual concluded with applause, a sip of sacred wine, and possibly a nap behind a pillar while someone else mopped up the sanctified drool. To modern eyes, divine possession might look like performance art meets heatstroke. But to ancient Egyptians, it was the pinnacle of religious experience. The moment when the divine broke through the sandstone barrier of reality to drop a few cryptic life tips. You'd think death would be enough to stop someone from getting invited to a party. Not in ancient Egypt. The line between the living and the dead was more of a soft suggestion, like don't swim after eating, or maybe don't chisel hieroglyphs drunk. Egyptians didn't just respect the dead. They actively included them in social plans. This wasn't metaphorical. The irony is that all this hair removal and sculpting was done without mirrors. That's right. Mirrors were rare and expensive. Most women styled themselves by feel with help from servants. So, your maid better have steady hands and zero passive aggression. One wrong move, and your widow's peak becomes a monstrosity. Renaissance beauty was less about natural charm and more about strategic subtraction. Remove the brows, remove the hairline, remove common sense, all in the name of elegance. Once the face had been thoroughly powdered, plucked, and poisoned, it was time to move on to the body. Specifically, squeezing it into shapes the human ribcage had no business aspiring to. Enter the Renaissance corset, equal parts fashion statement and orthopedic trauma. Renaissance corsets weren't quite the wasp-waisted death traps of later centuries, but they still meant business. Known as stays or bodies, these early versions were designed to flatten the torso, not cinch it. The goal was to create a smooth, rigid canvas that emphasized the bust and elongated the silhouette. Because what's sexier than looking like a very elegant plank? The stiffening materials? Whalebone if you were rich, reeds or pasteboard if you weren't. All of it sewn into linen and laced tightly across the back. Getting into one required assistance, determination, and a surprising tolerance for losing peripheral vision. A fully dressed noblewoman was essentially an armored artichoke, layered, spiked, and strangely delicate. And corsets weren't just about looks. They were moral statements. A straight, upright posture indicated inner virtue. Slouching, on the other hand, suggested moral laxity and possibly demonic possession. So if you were a well-bred lady, you stood straight, walked stiffly, and breathed in short, shallow gasps. Bonus points if you fainted gracefully in public. That just meant you were doing it right. Next, the corset unlacing. This was a spiritual experience, one that typically involved gasping, groaning, and possibly an audible crunch as ribs slowly regained their original shape. Women could finally breathe, not deeply, but enough to sigh in relief and perhaps whisper, "Never again." For the 100th time, the feet were peeled out of their slippers, revealing the crushed remains of what once resembled toes. If you were lucky, your servant brought a basin of warm water infused with lavender or rosemary to soak them. If not, you simply stared at your feet and wondered if you would ever experience joy again. Finally, you were rubbed down with sweet oils, or, if you were particularly devout or paranoid, an alchemical tonic promising to preserve your youth. Never mind that it smelled like old copper and likely contained powdered beetles. Beauty is pain and also possibly pestilence. And then, at last, the candle was blown out. Not with a huff, still too improper, but with a delicate puff, as if you were apologizing to the flame. You lay back, hairline 2 inches farther back than it was last year, skin slightly more ghostly than the day before, lungs recovering from corset trauma. But tomorrow you would do it all again. Because in Renaissance Florence, beauty wasn't just a look. It was a lifestyle, a full-time, high-stakes performance with no intermission, and the audience was everyone. Before being linked to crime syndicates and back-alley parlors, tattoos in Japan possessed a far more intricate and multi-layered identity, one deeply rooted in honor, mythology, and labor. Long before the Edo period, Japanese tattoos were used as punitive markings, burned or etched into the faces and arms of criminals to permanently brand them as outcasts. But by the 1600s, these crude symbols had evolved into something far more elaborate, something closer to art, devotion, and even spiritual armor. In Edo, Japan, society was rigidly structured. Class divisions were clear. The government responded with more bans. In the early 1800s, tattooing was officially outlawed, though enforcement varied depending on the region and who was doing the inspecting. Still, tattoo parlors went deeper underground. Horoshi had to work in secret. Clients booked sessions through coded language, and artists began developing techniques to hide tattoos under layers of ink or blend them into larger designs to confuse officials. The stigma wasn't just legal, it was social. Anyone visibly tattooed could be refused entry into public bathhouses, barred from temples, or denied marriage by respectable families. Tattooed bodies became taboo, and the art form, once a mark of bravery or spiritual symbolism, was recast as something vulgar, dangerous, even evil. But the tattoos didn't disappear. They simply went deeper, both under the skin and under the radar. For every government crackdown, there was a new design, a new hiding spot, a new client willing to endure pain for something meaningful. Irezumi didn't die. It went into hiding, like a coiled dragon waiting. As Japan stepped into the modern age with the Meiji Restoration in 1868, the new government was eager to present the country as civilized, orderly, and, most importantly, westernized. And in this new image in modern Japan, tattoos were deemed unacceptable. Irezumi, with its rich cultural history and underground allure, was stigmatized. The government reinforced this stance. Tattooing was not only considered a criminal act but also an embarrassment, something primitive and shameful. Foreign diplomats expressed their disapproval of the elaborate bodysuits worn by Edo's working-class individuals. Japan, eager to gain respect from the Western world, responded by driving tattooing even further into secrecy than before. Interestingly, despite being prohibited for Japanese citizens, tattooing became a tourist attraction. And, okay, maybe also a solid way to unwind after a long day of ruling the Nile Valley. It was all over their art. Pharaohs are pictured holding it. Party guests at banquets are passing it around like a floral peace pipe, and even mummies got decked out with it for the afterlife. The thinking seemed to be, if we're heading into eternity, let's make sure we're well stocked. Practical, right? But the Blue Lotus wasn't just for ceremonial use. Festivals could get pretty wild, and Blue Lotus-infused wine made the music sound louder, the dancing feel looser, and the hieroglyphic poetry marginally more profound. Picture a crowd beneath the stars, sipping lotus wine, feeling as light as a papyrus reed in the breeze. For the ancient Egyptians, that was both spiritual fulfillment and a darn good night. There are religious holidays, and then there's the feast of drunkenness. The ancient Egyptian way of saying, let's get blackout drunk in honor of not dying. Subtle name? Nope. Accurate? Absolutely. This annual celebration centered around the goddess Hathor, who, according to the myths, was once sent to punish humanity. But after a bloody rampage that would make any disaster movie blush, the gods decided humanity had maybe learned its lesson. So, they tricked her into drinking red beer that looked like blood. She passed out, woke up in a better mood, and just like that, mass extinction was narrowly avoided through alcohol poisoning. To commemorate this heroic hangover, Egyptians gathered once a year to get utterly wasted. Not metaphorically, not spiritually, but literally. The goal was to drink until you entered a divine trance, which sounds pretty poetic until you remember that this often meant collapsing face first into a mud brick courtyard surrounded by strangers yelling praises between hiccups. The ritual would start at dawn with music, clapping, and the ceremonial passing of drinks. Families visited tombs during festivals like the beautiful Feast of the Valley, lugging baskets of food, jugs of beer, and the general vibe of a tailgate party if the tailgate was parked in a necropolis. They'd sit outside the tomb, eat, drink, and commune with the deceased, which usually meant talking to the wall and hoping grandma appreciated the pickled fish. Many tombs had false doors, carved portals through which the dead could receive offerings. Whether this meant spiritually or just enjoying the smell from the other side is unclear. Either way, ancient Egyptians believed the dead could still enjoy food, drink, music, and a decent bit of gossip. So, naturally, they threw them parties. Music was played, incense was burned, libations were poured. Sometimes the living got drunk enough to cry, confess secrets, or accidentally sit on sacred offerings. It was like a family reunion, only with fewer arguments and slightly more embalming fluid. These gatherings weren't just acts of remembrance. They were also mutually beneficial transactions. The living fed the dead. The dead, in theory, blessed the living in return. Good crops, protection, fewer nightmares involving hippos, everyone won. Sometimes people even slept overnight in tombs, hoping for dream visions from their departed loved ones, or the occasional unsolicited advice from a former accountant turned ghost. Stop lending money to your brother, the dream might say. And also, the amulets go on the left. To modern sensibilities, this sounds macabre. To the Egyptians, it was completely logical. The afterlife wasn't a goodbye. It was just a new address. And if Great Uncle Horm wanted to attend the party via divine osmosis through a stone wall, who were they to say no? For all the incense, holy trances, and sanctioned debauchery, ancient Egyptian revelry came with a price, and it usually arrived sometime around sunrise with a pounding headache and the vague memory of yelling at a statue. Underneath, linen shifts helped absorb sweat because, newsflash, Florence in summer was not a place for heavy fabrics and no airflow. But elegance came first. Comfort came never. And yet, despite the discomfort, corsets had one major benefit. They held everything in place. Unlike modern bras that pretend to offer support while staging a quiet rebellion by noon, Renaissance stays offered the kind of structural reinforcement usually reserved for bridges. You could run, dance, or survive a fainting spell without anything shifting an inch. Of course, not everyone could afford such architectural fashion. Working-class women went without stays, favoring looser bodices and more breathable materials. But among the elite, corsets were essential. You weren't fully dressed without one, just tragically undone. The worst part? You had to eat while wearing one. Which brings us to the next Renaissance fashion paradox. Feasting like royalty while trying not to split a seam or collapse from restricted airflow. In Renaissance Italy, beauty wasn't just skin deep. It extended all the way to the dinner table, where fashion and food had an uneasy relationship. On the one hand, noble women were expected to attend lavish banquets and engage in the social theater of feasting. On the other hand, they had to do it while squeezed into a corset so tight their internal organs were basically roommates. Meals were grand affairs. Tables groaned under the weight of roasted peacock, marzipan sculptures, and gilded fruit. But for upper-class women, actually eating was a delicate performance. You could nibble, you could sip, but you absolutely could not unhinge your jaw and go to town on a goose leg. That would have been barbaric and potentially dangerous, given the boning in your bodice. Instead, you were expected to take dainty bites, keep your back straight, and smile through the growing pressure in your ribs. Samurai had swords, merchants had rules, and everyone else had restrictions. The Tokugawa shogunate enforced strict codes of dress and behavior, especially for the lower classes. Ornate robes, luxurious fabrics, and flashy jewelry were reserved exclusively for the elite. But human nature always finds a loophole. For the common man, particularly laborers, firemen, and gamblers, tattoos became a means to reclaim beauty, status, and identity. If you couldn't wear brocade on the outside, why not wear it on your skin? And so full-body tattoos flourished underground, hidden beneath plain work clothes but revealed in bathhouses, festivals, and intimate moments. These weren't random designs. They were stories, sleeves of swirling dragons, bodysuits of phoenixes, koi fish, cherry blossoms, Buddhist deities, and folkloric heroes. Each tattoo carried a specific meaning. A koi swimming upstream symbolized perseverance. A dragon on the back represented power and protection. These motifs weren't chosen on a whim. They were earned, sometimes one painful inch at a time. And the process was brutal. There were no machines and no antiseptic creams. Artists, known as horishi, used wooden handles and steel needles to hand-poke ink beneath the skin. The ink was often mixed with charcoal or natural pigments and hammered in using rhythmic strikes. Sessions lasted for hours, and full bodysuits could take years to complete. But the result was a living mural that transformed skin into a form of storytelling. Yet, despite their cultural richness, tattoos remained illegal for much of the Edo period. Authorities viewed them as signs of disorder, deviance, or wastefulness. And so the art of irezumi thrived in the shadows, respected by some, feared by others, and completely invisible to the ruling elite. In Edo period Japan, where wooden buildings were packed tightly together like kindling and open flames lit every lantern, fires were a constant and devastating threat. British and American sailors frequented Japanese ports, seeking out horishi to acquire exotic oriental body art as souvenirs. Ironically, the very art form that Japan tried to suppress was being preserved by the foreigners whose approval they craved. Nevertheless, the tradition endured. Horishi adapted by changing their clientele, relocating their studios to more secluded locations, and ensuring the Tabori method remained alive. Master-apprentice lineages continued in hushed tones. The techniques, symbolism, and tools were carefully passed down, often within families or close-knit artistic circles. In the 20th century, irezumi became deeply intertwined with the Yakuza. The full bodysuit, concealed beneath business attire, became a symbol of loyalty and intimidation within the criminal underworld. Once again, tattoos represented pain, honor, and secrecy, but this time lacking the folkloric charm of Edo firemen or mythological koi. The artistry remained, but public sentiment had shifted. Even today, the legacy of that stigma persists. Despite the contemporary global interest in tattoo culture, Japan continues to view tattoos with suspicion. Public baths, gyms, and even certain beaches restrict individuals with tattoos. The fear of criminal association persists, even when the ink is harmless. However, times are changing. Young Japanese artists are reclaiming irisae, not as an act of rebellion but as a celebration of their heritage. Museums are preserving ancient designs. Art enthusiasts and historians are finally recognizing the craftsmanship. A new generation is questioning why they should be ashamed of their own skin. In a culture characterized by layers of robes, meaning, and silence, Irezumi remains the most genuine expression that Japan attempted to conceal. In Renaissance Europe, openly discussing sex was considered taboo, unless, of course, it was done through lengthy Latin manuscripts filled with religious guilt and printed under the church's supervision. Priests encouraged revelers to drink as much as their hearts desired, which in this context was less of a blessing and more of a dare. Participants banged tambourines, danced in the streets, and reportedly saw the goddess, although whether that was Hathor or just the side of a clay jug is anyone's guess. But this wasn't just chaos for the sake of chaos. Well, mostly not. The idea was to honor the balance between destruction and joy, reminding everyone that even wrathful deities could be appeased with a strong enough brew. Think of it as theology meets a keg stand. And, importantly, this was sanctioned behavior. There were no awkward conversations the next day about what happened in the sacred grove. Getting drunk was part of the job description. If anything, not passing out was suspicious. Why aren't you spiritually elevated? Kumhotep? Do you hate the gods? Modern scholars have described the Feast of Drunkenness as a ritual of renewal. Participants purged their fears, inhibitions, and, most likely, their stomach contents, all in one divinely authorized party. The next day, headaches, regret, possibly a new scar shaped like Anubis, but also spiritual cleansing. Forget everything you know about beer. Ancient Egyptian beer wasn't golden, bubbly, or anything remotely resembling a beverage you'd order at a bar. It was thick, porridge-like, and alarmingly opaque, served with the kind of consistency that would confuse both your bartender and your dentist. Beer for the Egyptians wasn't just a social drink. It was practically a food group, made from partially baked loaves of emmer bread that were soaked in water, mashed, and fermented into a chunky slurry. It resembled a soupy oatmeal more than a refreshing ale. The technical term might be liquid bread, but let's not pretend this wasn't just a bowl of carbs in denial. Yes, even in a world where Blue Lotus was medicine and beer was breakfast, the morning after hit just as hard. Archaeological texts are suspiciously quiet regarding hangovers, likely because nobody felt like writing hieroglyphs when their head felt like it had been struck by Ra himself, but the evidence exists nonetheless. Medical papyri describe head pains and recommend treatments involving herbs, honey, and sometimes simply lying very still while pretending to commune with the gods. In more advanced cases, a ritual cleansing was advised, usually involving a priest, a bucket of cold Nile water, and possibly a stern lecture on moderation that no one ever remembered hearing. The real trick, of course, was plausible deniability. If you danced shirtless in the temple or passed out in a tomb alcove, you wouldn't say, "I overdid it." You'd say, "I was overcome by the divine." It wasn't a blackout. It was a mystical encounter with Hathor's laughter. Much more respectable, indeed. And for the truly unlucky souls, there was always purging, not metaphorically, but literally. The Egyptians were fond of emetics, lovely concoctions designed to evacuate your sins from both ends. Imagine being handed a drink that tastes like regret and being told, "This will restore your balance." Moments later, your balance would definitely be gone. The priests naturally fared better. They had training, ritual authority, and, most importantly, people to carry them home. Meanwhile, common revelers woke up with lotus petals in their hair and sandal imprints on their faces, wondering whether they danced with a god or simply someone very committed to the role. Still, nobody swore off the next celebration because spiritual enlightenment, as it turns out, is addictive, especially when it comes with beer, smoke, and a mild chance of falling into a trance and yelling your neighbor's secrets in front of a statue. Sometimes the act of sitting upright for hours and pretending to enjoy cold eel pie was enough to trigger a fainting spell, which, frankly, only added to the aesthetic. Pale, breathless, and collapsing into the arms of a handsome courtier. Asterisk magnifico. Of course, this polite self-starvation had limits. Many noble women were secretly ravenous by the time they reached their private chambers, where they could finally remove the corset and devour a hidden stash of sweetmeats or leftover cheese. Yes, even Renaissance beauty queens had midnight snacks. They just couldn't admit it. And there were rules even for those. Certain foods were believed to affect the complexion. Cucumbers were discouraged. They made the skin watery. Wine was encouraged. It flushed the cheeks with color. Some ladies even drank vinegar tonics to stay trim, because nothing says high fashion like ruining your gut lining. There was also the matter of digestion. In a corset, your stomach had nowhere to go. Women had to pace their eating carefully or risk indigestion, bloating, or, God forbid, a very unladylike burp. The horror. So, while men got to recline, drink heavily, and argue about Dante, women mastered the art of elegant restraint, eating just enough to seem sociable but never enough to ruin the line of their gown. Once the face was painted, the hair plucked, the corset tightened, and the food politely nibbled, it was time to smell expensive. In Renaissance Florence, your scent wasn't just a finishing touch. It was a social weapon. A noblewoman's fragrance was as carefully curated as her lineage, and failing to smell like imported luxury was basically a scandal. The Renaissance nose had standards. Common folk might reek of garlic, goat, and existential dread, but the elite, they wafted through salons and basilicas, trailing clouds of rose water, musk, ambergris, and exotic spices. If you walked past a duchess and didn't feel mildly intoxicated by her scent, she wasn't trying hard enough. The samurai might have ruled the land, but when your neighborhood caught fire, it was the fireman, or hikesher, who saved your life. These weren't firemen as we imagine them today. They didn't use hoses or wear flame-retardant suits. Instead, they carried hooks, axes, and raw courage. Their job wasn't to extinguish fires. It was to tear down nearby structures and create fire breaks before the flames could spread. This meant climbing onto burning rooftops and dismantling homes by hand, often while embers rained from the sky. Naturally, these men developed a culture of bravado, toughness, and brotherhood, and central to that culture was tattooing. Full-body tattoos, irizumi, became a badge of honor among the hikesher. Not only were they stunning displays of strength and endurance, but they were also deeply symbolic. Dragons represented power, tigers stood for courage, and gods and demons provided spiritual protection. When a fireman stripped off his uniform to reveal a full suit of swirling ink, it wasn't vanity. It was armor. And the pain was part of the point. Sitting for hundreds of hours while needles punctured the skin was a rite of passage. If you could endure that, you could face down an inferno. The tattoos weren't just decoration. They were proof of fearlessness, commitment, and pain endured for the good of the group. Some crews even shared themes, with all members sporting similar motifs to reflect unity. You might see entire teams marked with identical dragons across their backs or coordinated waves and blossoms swirling down their arms. This wasn't gang behavior. It was solidarity, a brotherhood forged through smoke and fire. But it wasn't legal. Tattoos were still frowned upon by the authorities, seen as vulgar or wasteful, especially for public servants. So, the hikesher wore their ink beneath their clothes, only revealing it in private bathhouses or celebratory festivals, where their role as local heroes gave them a pass, at least temporarily. This gave rise to the marriage manual, a peculiar genre of literature where theologians, monks, and celibate scholars explained how devout Christians were supposed to engage in sexual activity solely for procreation. Predictably, these manuals were less about sensual pleasure and more about the approved positions for the glory of God. Titles such as De Matrimonio or The Book of the Family concealed their true purpose. Detailed instructions on when, how, and why married couples could engage in sexual activity, complete with diagrams, calendars, and lists of prohibited days. Spoiler alert, there were many forbidden days. Sexual activity on Sundays was considered sinful, and feast days were strictly off-limits. During Lent, it was absolutely forbidden. In fact, there were approximately 180 days a year when marital intimacy was prohibited. When combined with the fear of damnation and the prying eyes of local priests, it's remarkable that Renaissance Europe managed to reproduce at all. These guides also provided advice on the appropriate mindset during intercourse. Joy was viewed with suspicion, passion was considered risky, and love was acceptable as long as it didn't lead to excessive enthusiasm. Women were encouraged to be submissive and silent, while men were cautioned against allowing their desire to burn too intensely. Essentially, the goal was spiritual unity accompanied by just enough physical action to conceive a child and nothing more. Despite the sterile language, these books enjoyed immense popularity, particularly among the clergy. Some manuals even included sections that differentiated between natural and unnatural sexual positions. The missionary position was considered divine, while anything else was seen as flirting with excommunication. Of course, educated Renaissance readers were adept at reading between the lines. These books were among the few texts that acknowledged sex at all, so people devoured them, not necessarily for religious reasons. This beer was consumed by everyone: peasants, priests, children, scribes, and anyone else trying to survive in a world where desert heat, crocodiles, and public works projects were daily concerns. It was calorically dense, slightly intoxicating, and cheaper than anything else that didn't require chasing it down with a spear. And here's the kicker: beer wasn't just for sustenance. It was often intentionally altered with herbs, spices, and other curious additives, especially during festivals or religious ceremonies. Want to commune with the gods? Add some mandrake. Want to forget the priest's speech about cosmic order? Toss in a little fermented date juice and hope for the best. Of course, hygiene was a concern, but beer had an answer for that too. Water could kill you, but beer had been boiled, fermented, and spiced. It was safer than the Nile and often more reliable than your coworkers. In terms of strength, Egyptian beer ranged from mildly numbing to I forgot how sandals work. While the alcohol content wasn't high by modern standards, the sheer quantity consumed more than made up for it. Workers on state projects like pyramid building were often paid in beer, a daily ration of several liters, which means that half of ancient Egyptian labor was fueled by liquid gluten and mild intoxication. Let's talk beer. Or rather, let's talk about a viscous, beige, bread-adjacent fluid that the ancient Egyptians cheerfully called beer, and that modern brewers would call a war crime. Egyptian beer was less a refreshing beverage and more a fermented soup with ambition, made by soaking half-baked loaves of emmer bread in water, then mashing the whole affair into a lumpy stew and letting it ferment in open vats. The final product was cloudy, chunky, and distressingly chewable. Imagine oatmeal if oatmeal had opinions and a mild buzz. But despite its texture, which archaeologists generously describe as rustic, this was the drink of the people. When ancient Egyptians prepared for death, they didn't just pack linens and a decent eulogy. They packed snacks, drugs, and possibly a backup stash, just in case eternity got boring. Because if you thought the partying stopped after your heart was weighed, think again. It simply moved underground. Tombs weren't silent, solemn places. They were carefully curated starter homes for the soul, complete with food, booze, and mood-enhancing herbal arrangements. Mummies were entombed with blue lotus petals, wine jugs, incense cones, and the occasional sealed mystery jar, which archaeologists now eye with both reverence and mild suspicion. Take Tutankhamun, for example. When Howard Carter cracked open his tomb, he didn't just find gold and furniture. He found wine, oils, herbs, and what can only be described as the ancient Egyptian version of a wellness kit. If a modern influencer were buried today, it would look disturbingly similar, minus the canopic jars, of course. This wasn't merely luxury. It was strategic. The soul, or BA, if you're fancy, needed nourishment and stimulation in the afterlife. Eternal bliss wasn't going to maintain itself, after all. So priests and embalmers made sure you were entombed with all your spiritual comfort items, food offerings, sacred perfume, and a generous dose of whatever got you through long temple ceremonies while pretending to be enlightened. Some tombs even include instructions to the dead on how to prepare and enjoy these items in the afterlife. It's not enough to carry Blue Lotus into eternity. Apparently, you also needed directions in case divine short-term memory was a thing. And let's not forget the opening of the mouth ritual, which was supposed to let the dead eat, speak, and, let's be honest, sip that sacred fermented beverage with proper technique. Because it's hard to toast Osiris with a closed jaw. All of this tells us one very clear thing. The ancient Egyptians did not separate pleasure from piety. Perfume was big business. Italy, especially Venice, was the European hub for distillation, but the most coveted ingredients came from farther afield. Frankincense from Arabia, myrrh from Ethiopia, cinnamon from Ceylon, and ambergris, a waxy, oddly pleasant-smelling substance from the intestines of sperm whales. It was outrageously expensive and wildly fashionable. Basically, the Renaissance equivalent of dabbing yourself with designer whale bath. These perfumes weren't just for pulse points. They were soaked into gloves, stitched into dress linings, and sprayed onto handkerchiefs that ladies would flutter dramatically whenever someone less hygienic came too close, which was often. Streets were filthy. People bathed irregularly. Perfume wasn't a luxury. It was armor. And for the ambitious beauty, scent layering was essential. First came the scented bath, usually a rinse of rose water or camphor. Then a dusting of crushed violet petals, followed by an oil rubbed into the temples or wrists, and finally, a heavy mist of whatever concoction your apothecary swore would make men weep and rivals faint. Some even wore pomanders, delicate perforated orbs filled with aromatic herbs, around the neck or waist. Others dangled them from their belts like olfactory warning bells. Approach with caution. I smell of cinnamon and judgment. But these potions weren't always benign. Some perfumes contained turpentine or tinctures so strong they could trigger headaches, nausea, or fainting. One wrong blend, and you went from seductive to insufferable. Still, the right fragrance could open doors, or at least noses. A woman who smelled divine had power to entrance, distract, or just to survive a crowd of unwashed poets. If Renaissance beauty was a battlefield, then fashion was the armor, and Florence was its glittering war zone. The fabric you wore didn't just say something about you. It screamed. It sang. Ironically, these same men were admired in their neighborhoods and feared by the elite. Their tattoos were marks of danger to some and of devotion to others. Beyond the fire brigades and labor crews, another group embraced the painful elegance of Irizumi, the gamblers, rogues, and thrill-seekers of Edo's underground. These were the drifters of the ukiyo, the floating world, a term that described both the pleasure quarters and the transient nature of existence itself. And in that fleeting world, tattoos were a language of risk, identity, and rebellion. Many of these men were bakudo, professional gamblers who roamed the country with dice, cards, and an uncanny ability to separate samurai from their stipends. While the bakudo had no formal organization at first, they lived by their own codes of loyalty, honor, and toughness. In a society that relegated them to the fringes, tattoos became a way to reclaim dignity, to turn a marginal life into one of meaning, one needle prick at a time. Their tattoos were bold, provocative, and unapologetically visible in the right settings. Peonies, fierce warriors, gods of fortune, and snakes slithered across their torsos. These weren't the quiet, contemplative inkings of monks or the civic pride of firemen. These were power statements, visual declarations that said, I don't follow your rules. I live by my own. Many designs referenced famous characters from Japanese folklore and kabuki theater, heroes like Sakata Kintoki, Minamoto no Yoshitsune, or even mythical rebels who challenged authority. The more outrageous the figure, the more admired the tattoo. It wasn't just skin-deep symbolism. It was branding in a society where no one handed you a name unless you fought for it. And yet, despite their outsider status, these men were crucial to the underground economy. They lent money, maintained order in red-light districts, and developed early proto-yakuza structures. Having a marriage manual on your shelf was perfectly acceptable, and what you highlighted within it was your own affair. Ironically, the strict moral codes promoted by these books only fueled people's curiosity about what lay beyond them, which is why another type of book began to circulate alongside marriage guides. These books were less holy and more illustrated. On the surface, they were scientific marvels, detailed anatomical treatises, often illustrated by respected artists and endorsed by university scholars. However, for anyone with a vivid imagination and a private space, these books possessed a certain appeal, especially when they depicted the female form. The Renaissance witnessed a surge of interest in human anatomy. fueled by the legalization of dissection in certain regions and the groundbreaking scientific observations of artists like Leonardo da Vinci. Texts such as De Humani Corporis Fabrica by Andreas Vesalius were regarded as revolutionary medical resources, but they were also, whether intentionally or not, somewhat titillating. The reason? They featured nude women depicted in exquisite, clinical detail. Breasts, hips, and genitalia were all included. While the stated purpose was educational, it's safe to say that not all readers were interested in the lymphatic system. These images were often presented with artistic flair. One particularly notorious edition of an anatomical book featured a nude woman gracefully reclining, as if in a Botticelli painting, except her chest cavity was flayed open like a diagram in a butcher's manual. It was both horrifying and strangely sensual, portraying the body as art, science, and, for some, entertainment. Because pornography was strictly forbidden by the church, these illustrations slipped through the moral loopholes under the guise of medical necessity. Everyone drank it. Pharaohs, priests, peasants, toddlers. Because when water might kill you, and milk was suspicious at best, beer was the least deadly option with a pleasant side effect. It was calorie-dense, mildly intoxicating, and often served in communal jugs. Because nothing says spiritual unity like 5 adults slurping from a pot of soggy bread water. At temples and festivals, the beer might be enhanced with herbs, dates, honey, or mystery ingredients that were either sacred or just experimental. Historians are still unsure if the addition of mandrake was intentional or if someone was just tired of reality. This was also the go-to payment method for laborers. Pyramid workers didn't clock out with coins. They received daily beer rations, sometimes several liters per day. This means the guys hauling limestone blocks all morning were doing it buzzed and breaded. And somehow the pyramids still got built. Let that sink in the next time you miss a deadline with a cappuccino in hand. Probably tasted awful. But if you're living in 1300 BCE, covered in sand, and trying not to die of dysentery, a lukewarm jar of beer porridge is Michelin star cuisine. Also, no foam, no carbonation, no glass bottles, just ceramic jugs, straws with filters to catch the bigger bread chunks, and a national commitment to ignoring mouthfeel. Now that you've washed down your bread beer with a floral buzz, it's time to set the mood with smoke. But not just any smoke. We're talking kifi, the ancient Egyptian incense that made temples smell like divine bakeries and left everyone wondering if they were actually meditating or just very, very lightheaded. Kifi wasn't a quick hit of frankincense. This was the perfumed love child of an apothecary and a pastry chef. Recipes varied by temple, but the ingredients often included myrrh, honey, wine, raisins, cinnamon, juniper, mint, and whatever other spices were lying around not being sacrificed. If something brought them closer to the gods in life, even if it was a psychoactive flower soaked in wine, it belonged in the tomb along with your amulets, your linen headrest, and possibly a starter pack of dreams. Ancient Egypt gave the world pyramids, mummies, and eyeliner that could block out the sun, but it also perfected an unspoken truth of civilization. Sometimes the people running things are just high enough to think it's going well. Officially, the pharaoh was the earthly embodiment of Horus, chosen by the gods to maintain Ma'at, cosmic order. Unofficially, temple priests had the keys to the sacred stash, the incense budget, and the daily schedule of who got to chant next to a burning bush of kifi until they passed out. The religious elite weren't just spiritual guides. They were state-sanctioned pharmacists, supplying the population with everything from calming ointments to full-blown psychedelic experiences disguised as Holy Communion. If it smelled strong, tingled on contact, or made you speak in metaphor for 3 days, it probably came out of the priesthood's apothecary. And while pharaohs wore the crowns, it was the priests who knew how to blend mandrake with wine and not kill anyone. This gave them an enormous amount of soft power, not just in healing and ritual, but in managing the emotional and mystical tone of society. You didn't ask, "What's going on with the harvest?" You asked, "What did the high priest see in his trance last night?" Spoiler alert, it was usually a falcon and a lot of swirling gold light. Let's not forget the economic side of things. The temples were landowners, employers, and massive centers of drug production. Blue lotus didn't grow itself. Someone had to harvest it, dry it, ferment it, and whisper to it in sacred verse. So yes, religion was very holy, but it was also a well-oiled machine, one that ran on faith, herbs, and occasionally mind-altering doses of divine inspiration. It flounced down the street, declaring your family's wealth, your husband's rank, and whether or not you had any shame in bankrupting him for a sleeve. Velvet was the crown jewel, imported, dyed, and woven with the kind of care usually reserved for saints' relics. Velvet was thick, heavy, and absurdly expensive. Wearing it in summer, a true power move. You were hot, yes, but you were important. Then came brocade, not content with mere color. Brocade brought patterns into the picture. Lions, vines, even entire religious scenes woven in gold thread. And we're not talking about subtle accents. These were gowns that could double as altarpieces. The more intricate the design, the more time and money it took, which meant the more smugly you could nod at other women's inferior sleeves. Sleeves, by the way, were detachable, a practical feature turned competitive sport. Wealthy women owned entire wardrobes of sleeves to mix and match, flaunting them like today's designer handbags. Embroidered, puffed, slashed, pearl-encrusted. Some sleeves were so elaborate they needed their own storage system and, occasionally, their own servants. Colors were coded, too. Deep blues and crimsons were made with rare dyes like lapis lazuli and cochineal, pigments so expensive they were locked away like treasure. Only the rich could afford these hues, and sumptuary laws in places like Florence tried and failed to restrict certain colors to the nobility. But laws are boring. Dresses were not. Even the under layers were ornate. Shifts were trimmed with lace. Petticoats peeked out in silken flashes. And girdles, belt-like accessories, weren't just decorative. Some were studded with gems and hidden pockets for perfume, prayer books, or possibly revenge notes. But all this fashion came at a price, literally. A single gown could cost more than a year's wages for a craftsman. And yet, noble women didn't just have these gowns. They needed them. Their tattoos became both a badge and a warning. Loyalty within, danger without. Tattooing shops flourished in this world, not always marked with signs, but known through whispers and connections. The horishi became revered figures, their work whispered about in bathhouses and behind sake counters. To be inked by a famous master was an honor. To endure the hours of stabbing pain was a show of grit. For gamblers and rogues, Irizumi was more than art. It was an identity carved in pain, proudly worn in a world that had no place for them. Though tattooing in Edo Japan is often portrayed as a masculine tradition of laborers, firefighters, and gamblers, women also left their mark, sometimes quite literally, on this hidden world of ink. While rarely documented in official records, female tattoos existed quietly, tenderly, and rebelliously beneath the layers of silk and propriety. In many cases, these tattoos were intimate, romantic, and intensely personal. Unlike the large mythological bodysuits of their male counterparts, women's tattoos were often smaller, discreet, and emotionally charged. Lovers would tattoo each other's names on hidden parts of their bodies, inside the upper arm, on the inner thigh, near the collarbone. This gesture was known as Irizumi Chobun, or love tattoos. A popular phrase inked onto women's skin was Inochi Azukamasu, meaning, I entrust you with my life. It was more than a vow. It was a declaration of emotional surrender written in pain. Men sometimes carried similar inscriptions showing mutual commitment beyond what any formal wedding could offer. This kind of tattooing was especially common among lovers in the ukiyo, the floating world of pleasure districts where courtesans and geisha reigned. Among high-ranking courtesans, tattoos were sometimes a tool of seduction. A small, teasing mark, visible only when a robe slipped just right, became part of the mystique. A young man caught with a suggestive woodcut from a medical book could simply claim that he was pursuing his studies, the fact that the page was dog-eared and mysteriously thumb-worn being irrelevant. Some printers even capitalized on the dual appeal. Certain editions were produced with particular attention to the female form, featuring idealized nudes that blended anatomy with eroticism, creating a sort of Renaissance loophole. If you desired to look at naked people, all you had to do was feign an interest in the spleen. These publications weren't confined to back alleys. They were printed by reputable presses, collected in university libraries, and cited by physicians. However, beneath the dry Latin and muscle diagrams, there was just enough soft-core temptation to keep readers turning the pages with slightly more enthusiasm than necessary. Of course, not all forbidden books pretended to be scientific. Some didn't even bother to conceal their true nature. By the mid-Renaissance, a new type of book began to appear in private collections, one that dispensed with anatomical dissection or theological loopholes. These were full-blown love manuals, half etiquette guide and half soft seduction playbook. They were written for the well-bred nobleman or lady who desired to flirt without directly condemning themselves to hell. Unlike the rigid, rule-bound marriage manuals sanctioned by the church, love manuals reveled in ambiguity. They straddled a fine line, offering advice on courtship, letter writing, and romantic speech, all under the guise of promoting refined behavior. However, between the lines, they oozed innuendo. These books taught the art of the meaningful glance, the science of sighing in someone's direction, and the importance of hand placement during a slow court dance. They provided sample dialogues, thinly veiled pickup lines for situations such as encountering a duchess in a garden or complimenting a lady's lute playing without offending her chaperone. Mix it all up, let it ferment, dry it into pellets, and burn them slowly in sacred spaces until everyone either felt deeply spiritual or forgot why they walked in. It was used in ritual purification, which is code for, let's fill this room with enough fragrant smoke to erase our sins, or at least our memories of last night's feast of drunkenness. Temples didn't have ventilation, by the way. That was considered breaking the mood. So imagine standing in a limestone cube next to a sweating priest waving a smoking dish of kiffy like it's Febreze for the soul, while a chant drones in Coptic monotone behind you. Visions weren't just encouraged. They were practically inevitable. Whether divine revelation or mild asphyxiation, it didn't really matter. The gods got their tribute either way. To the Egyptians, kiffy wasn't just air freshener. It was medicine, perfume, and spiritual elevator all in one. Pliny the Elder later wrote that kiffy could cure snake bites and improve sleep, which makes sense if you assume the goal was to pass out entirely. Some recipes were so complex they read like ancient IKEA manuals. 16 ingredients, each added in precise phases under specific moons. Honestly, it's a miracle anything got done. But once lit, the aroma drifted across the Nile like a sacred fog machine, signaling that something holy was happening or that someone was overcompensating for yesterday's fish market. Even in death, kiffy lingered. It was burned during mummification, buried in tombs, and probably responsible for at least one pharaoh being accidentally embalmed in a spice rub. In short, kiffy was Egypt's way of saying, if you can't drink it, burn it and breathe deeply. If Blue Lotus was Egypt's chill friend, and kiffy was the drama queen with a smoke machine, then Mandrake was the slightly unhinged guest you invited once and immediately regretted. In many ways, the question of who ruled Egypt was less about crowns and more about who controlled the incense burners. Because if the gods spoke through visions and the visions came after a priest sniffed something pungent in a sealed chamber, well, you do the math. In theory, ancient Egypt was all about balance, justice, and order. In practice, if you were rich enough to afford a private tomb and someone to fan you while you digested, you also had access to the good stuff, the kind of narcotic rarities that didn't show up in the village clinic scrolls. Make no mistake, ancient Egyptian society was a hierarchy, and mind-altering substances followed the same rules as everything else. Pharaoh at the top, goat herder at the bottom, and everyone else politely sniffing dried flowers and pretending it was enough. While commoners got barley beer and maybe a whiff of temple incense if they leaned close enough, the elite were bathing in blue lotus oil and sipping spiked pomegranate wine out of gold-rimmed chalices. Some of the more potent substances, Mandrake kiffy blends laced with opium, imported cannabis resins, were likely restricted to ritual or medical use, which just happened to align perfectly with the daily schedules of court officials and high priests. Funny how that worked out. Take Pharaoh himself. The divine ruler of Upper and Lower Egypt couldn't be expected to process the metaphysical weight of ruling without a little help from the sacred pharmacopoeia. If his dreams were considered state messages from the gods, then sedating his insomnia with a psychoactive nightcap wasn't indulgence. It was national security. Even in death, the elite kept their stash close. Many tombs contain medicinal vials, incense cones, and wine jars with labels so vague, They may as well have read, for ceremonial purposes only. One wonders if the gods actually required that much imported poppy resin, or if Tutankhamun just liked to keep his options open. Every social event was a stage, and every outfit a statement. Wearing the same thing twice. Social suicide. Renaissance fashion didn't stop at the ankle, though, in fairness, no one was really supposed to see your ankles. Modesty dictated that a woman's feet be kept decently hidden beneath layers of brocade and silk, which was a pity considering how completely ridiculous Renaissance footwear often was. Let's start with the chopin, the most theatrical shoe ever invented. Chopins were essentially high platform soles. Think ancient Roman sandals crossed with stilts. Originally from Venice, they were designed to keep fine dresses above the muddy, plague-infested streets. But over time, function gave way to fashion, and Chopins got taller. Much taller. Some were over 20 inches high. Yes, that's not a typo, 20 inches. They needed a certain balance, training, and quite often a servant on each arm for support. Walking unassisted was seen as both a physical achievement and a social gamble. If you took a tumble, it wasn't just your pride that suffered. You could easily bring down half the wedding party with you. In Florence, the Chopins weren't quite as extreme, but the trend still filtered down. Wealthy women favored delicate, pointed slippers, often crafted from velvet, embroidered with silk thread, and lined with fur. These were strictly indoor shoes. When venturing outside, they wore pattens, wooden or cork platforms strapped beneath their slippers to shield them from the dirty streets. A practical solution, perhaps, until you tripped and risked shattering your kneecaps on the unforgiving cobblestones. Foot binding wasn't practiced in Renaissance Italy, but the pressure to possess dainty, narrow feet was definitely present. Shoes were pointed, narrow, and certainly not designed for actual walking. But who needed to walk when you could gracefully move from a sedan chair to a grand palace hall, leaving a trail of crushed flower petals and broken arches in your wake? It created the illusion of intimacy, as if a client were seeing something forbidden. In reality, the tattoo may have been shared with dozens of clients, each believing it was a private secret. In other cases, tattoos signified heartbreak or betrayal. A courtesan might burn or slash a name tattooed on her body after a lover abandoned her, turning passion into a scarred testimony. Some even covered these names with new ink, dragons swallowing letters, waves washing away memories. But for women outside the pleasure quarters, tattoos could also be acts of quiet rebellion. Peasant women, fisherwomen, or wives of tattooed men sometimes followed suit, inspired by the artistry or solidarity. Though they risked judgment, these women wore their ink privately under their robes as silent declarations of autonomy. While Edo society officially condemned such markings, especially on women, these tattoos carved out a hidden narrative, one of love, agency, and pain born, a story the official histories never bothered to write down. Behind every breathtaking bodysuit, every swirling dragon, and tragic hero etched in flesh, there stood the unsung artisans of Edo, Japan, the horoshi, or tattoo masters. They worked quietly in tucked-away corners of the city, anonymous rooms above tea houses, back rooms of barbershops, or candlelit apartments that smelled of incense and ink. There were no flashing signs, no customer reviews, just a reputation passed by word of mouth and inked skin. Becoming a horoshi was no casual decision. It took years of training, usually through apprenticeship under a master. The tools were basic. Wooden handles with clusters of steel needles at the tip, dipped into a thick black ink called sumi, made from soot and animal glue. The technique was painstakingly slow and deeply painful. The needles were jabbed rhythmically into the skin by hand, often with a bamboo mallet. One popular genre was the epistolary romance, collections of fictional love letters between imaginary nobles, typically named Count Lorenzo and Lady Fiammetta. These were intended to model virtuous behavior, but many letters veered suspiciously close to fantasy. You could almost hear the bodices tightening and the gloves slowly being removed. Some of these manuals even included miniature poems and riddles, just enough to appear cultured, just vague enough to be interpreted as scandalous. The Renaissance reader appreciated double meanings, and love manuals provided them in elegant rhyming couplets. And let's not forget the advice on grooming. One manual suggested that men keep their fingernails clean and teeth white so that a woman, when kissed, feels neither scratched nor offended. Others reminded ladies to maintain fresh breath and avoid onions before a romantic conversation. Practical, but not exactly spiritual. While these books didn't depict physical intimacy, they hinted at it constantly, which was precisely the point. They focused less on lust and more on tension, the kind that slowly built across candlelit ballrooms, behind fans, and through veils. For young nobles trapped between arranged marriages and strict religious codes, these manuals offered escape hatches, legal to own but dangerous to comprehend. While the church cracked down on sin and scholars debated virtue, some Renaissance readers were secretly stashing ancient Roman poetry under their pillows, and not the kind that Cicero would have approved of. Ovid's Ars Amatoria, or The Art of Love, was one of the most widely circulated forbidden texts of the Renaissance. Technically a Roman classic, it offered a step-by-step guide to seduction, from identifying a potential lover at the theater to feigning jealousy, just enough to keep things interesting. It was witty, elegant, and utterly immoral by church standards, which naturally made it extremely popular. With its forked roots that vaguely resembled tiny humans and a reputation that scared even seasoned priests, mandrake was less herbal remedy and more botanical dare. Used in ancient Egyptian medicine as both a painkiller and a possible aphrodisiac, which is always a terrifying combination, mandrake earned its place in temple recipes and medical scrolls with the kind of cautious reverence usually reserved for wild animals and pharaohs in a bad mood. The Ebers Papyrus, that handy ancient medical text that sounds like it belongs in a Harry Potter class, lists mandrake for insomnia, fertility, and strengthening the heart, which sounds noble until you remember that the wrong dose could just as easily strengthen your heart into cardiac arrest. See, mandrake contains alkaloids like scopolamine and atropine, the kind of compounds that mess with your nervous system and occasionally convince you that your bed is melting. In small doses, it was mildly relaxing. In slightly bigger ones, Welcome to Night Terrors, starring R.A. and a crocodile in a wig. And then there's the harvesting myth. According to later folklore, likely inherited from these early associations, pulling a mandrake root out of the ground caused it to scream loudly, lethally. So naturally, the solution was to tie it to a dog, cover your ears, and let the poor creature yank it free while you hoped your neighbors didn't ask too many questions. While there's no solid evidence the Egyptians were tying plants to dogs and waiting for shrieks, the idea that the plant had spiritual and slightly terrifying power fits right in. Mandrake may have been used in rituals, fertility rites, or just slipped into beer for those who preferred their hallucinations with a rooty aftertaste. In any case, it wasn't an everyday herb. Mandrake was for priests, magicians, and those who didn't mind taking medical advice from a man covered in gold leaf. Meanwhile, the lower classes weren't exactly locked out of the experience. They just had to settle for the watered-down versions. Beer thick enough to chew, weak incense, and whatever passed for spiritual euphoria during an 18-hour shift building obelisks. And when someone did get their hands on a forbidden substance without a permit, that was likely called witchcraft, heresy, or a very bad day to be a field laborer. After 14 chapters of sacred snorting, divine day drinking, and hallucinogenic healthcare, one might be tempted to ask, what does all this really say about ancient Egypt? Well, for starters, it tells us they were brilliant at blending science, spirituality, and recreational chemistry into a single belief system. Pain relief and prophecy came from the same flower. Medicine and mysticism walked hand in hand, usually to the beat of a cymbal and the smell of something smoldering that definitely wasn't FDA approved. It also reveals just how much the ancients respected the power of altered states not as escapism, but as a legitimate way to access insight, healing, and the occasional god with an animal head and a flair for drama. Their rituals weren't just pageantry. They were controlled chemical theater with incense, chanting, and psychotropic tea for the caste, and the strict gatekeeping of sacred substances. That's just the ancient version of putting wellness behind a paywall. The elite had their Blue Lotus spas and imported opium. Everyone else got lukewarm beer and an eye infection. Divine enlightenment was available, but only if you could afford the luxury tomb package with optional afterlife minibar. But perhaps the most revealing takeaway is this. Humans have always wanted to feel more, see more, and know more, especially if it involves lying down in a temple and not doing chores. The ancient Egyptians weren't that different from modern humans meditating with essential oils or arguing about microdosing on podcasts. And then, of course, there were the stockings. Women wore finely knit stockings made of silk or wool, secured at the knee with ribbons. These ribbons were sometimes scented, because if someone happened to catch a glimpse of your shin, you definitely wanted to ensure you smelled absolutely fabulous. Naturally, women of the lower classes wore simpler shoes, sturdy leather ones for work and clogs for wet conditions. However, the noble class treated footwear as a secret weapon. Hidden from view, entirely impractical, and incredibly expensive. All of it served to reinforce a single powerful message. Real ladies didn't walk. They floated. They glided. They suffered with grace and impeccable style. After enduring hours of being powdered, plucked, laced, perfumed, padded, and elevated on platforms, what came next? That's correct, dancing. Because nothing truly completes the Renaissance beauty ritual quite like trying to glide across a flawlessly polished marble floor in what feels like 20 pounds of fabric while struggling to breathe with limited lung capacity. Courtly dances were serious affairs. These weren't your relaxed, carefree tavern-style reels. No, Renaissance court dances were slow, elegant, and painstakingly choreographed. Every single step was meticulously rehearsed, and every movement carried a symbolic meaning. An incorrect foot placement could imply social ineptitude, and a misstep could be considered scandalous. You might as well loudly declare, "I own absolutely nothing," and run barefoot into the Arno River. For noble women, dancing was essentially a test of composure. The most popular dances, like the pavan or the galliard, required gliding in precise patterns, maintaining a modest gaze, and, under no circumstances, breathing through your mouth. That was considered utterly undignified, which was unfortunate, considering that corsets didn't exactly allow for deep breaths. Every galliard leap was a calculated gamble against fainting. This process, called tebari, required steady hands, infinite patience, and the mental endurance of a monk. But Horishi weren't just craftsmen. They were storytellers, historians, and psychologists. A good tattoo master had to understand not only how to tattoo but what to tattoo. Every design carried meaning. A cherry blossom fading into waves symbolized the transience of life. A tiger climbing a mountain represented bravery in the face of impossible odds. The client might bring a request, but the Horishi would decide the placement, the balance, and the soul of the piece. Clients would return over and over, sometimes for years, to complete their full suit. A bodyscape that stretched from shoulder to thigh, across the back, down the arms, and often stopping just above the wrist and neckline. This wasn't random. Tattoos had to remain hidden beneath daily clothing to avoid trouble with the authorities. Some Horishi signed their work, not visibly, but secretly within the folds of a dragon's tail or hidden in the petals of a lotus. These subtle signatures became a badge of pride, recognizable only to those in the know. Despite the intimacy of the work, Horishi lived with one foot outside of society. Their clientele were often firemen, gamblers, courtesans, people outside the elite. So the artists, too, lived on the edge, revered by the underground, invisible to the powerful. Irizumi wasn't just something you wore. It was something you survived. Every line, every shade, every drop of color came at a price, measured in hours of motionless endurance and days of aching flesh. In Edo, Japan, the pain of tattooing wasn't a drawback. It was the entire point. Tebari, the traditional hand-poked method used by Horishi, was brutal by design. The artist would dip the cluster of needles into sumi ink, then tap them rhythmically into the skin using a wooden stick or mallet. The process was slow, incredibly slow. Educated men and some very determined women kept copies of Ovid hidden behind Bibles or bound in blank covers to avoid detection. Marginalia in some surviving copies includes notes such as, "Try this at Carnival," and "Worked on Cecilia," proving that Latin didn't have to be boring. Then there was The Golden Ass by Apuleius, a novel that slipped under the radar due to its mythological storyline but included vivid scenes of transformation, lust, and the occasional talking donkey. It was technically a spiritual allegory but also erotica with a toga on. Even more daring were translations of Greek and Arabic love poetry. many of which emphasized sensual pleasure as a path to enlightenment. Renaissance Italy had a taste for the exotic, and Arabic texts like those inspired by the perfumed garden circulated in small, elite circles. These weren't openly sold, but if you had the right connections and enough gold, a copy might find its way to your study. Booksellers knew how to play the game. Officially, their shops were stocked with theology and grammar. Unofficially, a wink and a discreet coin could grant you access to a locked cabinet labeled medical curiosities or private readings. The church condemned it as sinful, but the merchants saw it as good business. Some nobles even commissioned illuminated manuscripts of these works, decorated with gold leaf cherubs and, occasionally, very detailed illustrations of things that cherubs shouldn't be watching. These books weren't just read. They were experienced, passed around at salons, whispered about at masquerades, banned by bishops, and quoted by poets. While everyone pretended they only read them for the Latin practice, the truth was obvious. Despite all the secret reading and scandalous giggling behind lace fans, the Renaissance wasn't a safe haven for literary freedom, especially with the Inquisition constantly watching. And in Italy, it always was. Used carefully, it could induce sleep, reduce pain, and maybe inspire a sensual poem or two. Used recklessly, you'd wake up 4 days later convinced you were a scarab beetle. Somewhere in the vast scrolls of Egyptian medical wisdom, wedged between cures for crocodile bites and the proper placement of amulets on inflamed body parts, lies a quiet little mention of Shem Shemet. That's right, cannabis. Because when it came to pain relief, the ancient Egyptians didn't just rely on divine intervention or chewing reeds until they forgot their problems. Sometimes they reached for something a little more herbal. Cannabis appears in medical texts like the Ebers Papyrus and the Ramesseum Papyrus mostly as a treatment for inflammation, sore eyes, and various gynecological complaints. Yes, gynecological. Ancient Egyptian women may have had access to THC-infused suppositories, which sounds like a modern wellness trend someone is definitely going to try to resurrect on Etsy. Of course, the Egyptians didn't roll joints or bake brownies with it. At least not that we know of. Cannabis was usually crushed into oils, mixed into salves, or blended with honey. Because if you're going to medicate, why not make it taste nice? Applied topically, it soothed pain. Inhaled accidentally, well, now the temple incense makes a lot more sense. Was it recreational? Officially, no. Unofficially? Probably. When you're running a civilization in 120-degree heat with limited plumbing and a deeply unpredictable crocodile problem, no one blames you for accidentally over-medicating. And if your high priest starts talking to statues a little too confidently, well, who's to say that isn't divine wisdom? There's also physical evidence. Residue analysis from mummies and burial sites has turned up trace amounts of cannabis along with opium and nicotine, which raises either some fascinating pharmacological questions or suggests the world's most suspicious funeral offerings. And let's not ignore the priests. They just wore more eyeliner and took their hallucinations more seriously. So what does this mean for us? Well, maybe that our ancestors weren't primitive drug enthusiasts or eccentric spiritualists. Maybe they were just doing their best to navigate a confusing, beautiful, often painful world with the tools, rituals, and fragrant smoke they had. And if that journey to inner peace happened to involve wine, wildflowers, and a trance where you barked like Anubis, so be it. Florence, late 1400s. The air was thick with incense, sweat, and the perfume of crushed roses. The city was bursting with art, intellect, and political intrigue, but also a very specific kind of madness, the obsession with beauty. And not just any beauty, Renaissance beauty, the kind that meant looking like a porcelain statue, even if it killed you. Enter ceruse, a luxurious, silky white face paint made from, you guessed it, lead. Yes, actual lead. Women across Florence, Venice, and beyond smeared this shimmering poison across their cheeks, foreheads, and décolletage to achieve that ultra-pale, ethereal look. Because in a world where tan skin meant laboring under the sun like a peasant, looking like a walking cadaver was the ultimate flex. But this wasn't just a light dusting of powder. No, ceruse was layered on like Venetian stucco. Some women went so far as to sleep in it, refusing to wash their faces, allowing the toxic compound to literally soak into their skin. The result? A radiant, ghostly glow right up until the sores appeared. And when they did, they just applied more lead to cover them. Like a Renaissance Band-Aid, one that guaranteed the wound would never heal. If the lead didn't get you, the mercury might. Used to treat blemishes and fade sunspots, mercury was another charming element in the Renaissance beauty arsenal. Combine that with arsenic-based tonics and vinegar face baths, and you had a full-blown chemical warfare routine marketed as elegance. And yet, it was crucial. A woman's grace on the dance floor was as vital to her reputation as her dowry. Parents hired dance tutors in the same way that modern influencers hire lighting designers. You learned precisely how to turn, how to bow, and how to use a fan just enough to appear mysterious, but not so much that you looked sweaty. The ultimate goal was to radiate effortless control, even as your shoes caused blisters and your ribs protested. There was also the important matter of social strategy. Dancing provided rare opportunities for brief interactions with eligible men. Gloved hands might touch for a fleeting moment, eyes might meet during a bow, and perfumes would mingle in the air. It was flirtation with footnotes. But if you said too much, moved too boldly, or, heaven forbid, laughed, you risked ruining your entire carefully cultivated image of pious elegance. Meanwhile, the constant background noise of every court event was a chorus of judgment. Other women critiqued your gown, your hairstyle, and your posture. Servants whispered, tutors fretted, and all the while, you had to maintain the illusion that none of it mattered. But it absolutely did. A clumsy turn or a curtsy performed even slightly off rhythm could haunt you for weeks. So you danced, you smiled, you endured, and when the music finally stopped, you excused yourself to reapply powder to your sweat-streaked face before round 2. The guests had all left, the candles had melted into pools of wax, and the Renaissance noble woman, appearing divine, dazzling, and delicately dying inside, finally made her way back to her chambers. But sleep? Not yet. First came the Renaissance version of the nighttime routine. Spoiler alert. It involved less self-care and more controlled deterioration. Step 1. The unmasking. Out came the linen cloths, rose water, and raw egg whites. A single outline could take hours, and a full-body tattoo might require years of regular sessions, each lasting half a day or more. There were no numbing creams, no mercy, only the sound of steady tapping and the raw sting of every puncture. But the pain was more than physical. It was symbolic. It separated the dilettantes from the devoted. It was a test of will, patience, and mental control. Clients didn't just receive tattoos. They earned them. And the endurance it took to sit through these sessions became a badge of honor, often discussed with quiet pride in bathhouses and taverns. Firefighters believed that the agony strengthened their courage. Gamblers viewed it as a test of luck and loyalty. Courtesans and lovers took on the pain as a symbol of their emotional depth. For some, it was a punishment. For others, purification. There was a spiritual dimension to it as well. Enduring pain was seen as a kind of self-discipline, similar to fasting or meditation. Buddhist themes were common in Irizumi, not just because of their aesthetic value, but because they reflected ideas of suffering, rebirth, and enlightenment. With each completed session, a person didn't just come closer to finishing a tattoo. They came closer to transformation. And there were rules. You couldn't flinch, you couldn't cry out. Moving too much could ruin the design or earn you a scolding from the horishi. Only the most serious clients completed their full bodysuit, known as munwari, with a chest panel left blank to avoid shocking society if the robe fell open. In a world where the elite wore silk and status, the tattooed wore pain and permanence. Every inch of an Edo tattoo told a story. These weren't random designs picked from a menu. They were mythologies mapped onto the body, carefully chosen symbols, each one with layered meanings encoded in swirling ink that stretched from shoulder to ankle. For the tattooed in Edo, Japan, the body became a canvas of personal folklore. By the mid-1500s, the Catholic Church had become increasingly suspicious of books that could corrupt the soul, which in practice meant anything remotely entertaining. In 1559, Pope Paul IV issued the first official Index Librorum Prohibitorum, or Index of Forbidden Books. It was exactly what it sounded like, a hit list of texts deemed too dangerous, heretical, or God forbid, titillating. The list included everything from Protestant theology to astrology manuals, but buried among them were treatises on love, anatomy, and even poetry. Ovid was banned, Boccaccio's Decameron was banned, and anything by Erasmus that even hinted at individual thought was double banned. The church wasn't just trying to save souls. It was sanitizing the entire intellectual bloodstream. Possessing a forbidden book didn't just result in a slap on the wrist. If you were a printer, merchant, or noble caught with one, you risked public penance, house searches, confiscation, and even imprisonment. More than one scholar found himself summoned to explain why he had a Latin copy of The Art of Love, tucked between Aristotle and Aquinas. But the funny thing about banning books is that it usually makes them more desirable. Underground markets flourished. Printers in Venice, Lyon, and Basel published clean editions for public sale and uncut readers' editions for private clients. The difference might be a missing passage, a toned-down illustration, or a completely fake title page. One infamous copy of The Golden Ass was rebound as Sermons of St. Augustine. Talk about a plot twist. Noble families with private libraries developed elaborate systems for hiding forbidden texts, including secret compartments, false bindings, and mirrored cabinets. It was part espionage and part erotica. A well-curated bookshelf conveyed the message, "Yes, I fear God, but I also read scandalous material." Women were particularly adept at this, as they were less likely to be targeted as intellectual threats. These were men trained to chant for hours, interpret dreams, and stare into incense smoke until something stared back. If their rituals involved cannabis, it wasn't for giggles. It was to facilitate communication with the gods, or at the very least with the wall. Somewhere in the dimly lit, sweet-smelling corners of the ancient Egyptian temple pharmacy, just behind the dried lizards and holy ointments, sat the opium stash. Small, wrinkled poppy pods imported from the eastern Mediterranean, tucked away like a divine secret. Because when you've got plague, pain, and pyramid-related back injuries, sometimes prayer alone doesn't cut it. Though not native to Egypt, opium poppies likely made their debut through trade with Cyprus or Crete. The Egyptians were nothing if not enthusiastic early adopters. By the time of the New Kingdom, poppies were well on their way to becoming the ancient world's go-to sedative, a medical miracle wrapped in mild addiction. Opium didn't just dull pain. It smoothed over childbirth, calmed coughs, soothed gastrointestinal rage, and made temple chants about cosmic balance feel like they actually had a beat. Administered in drinks, pills, or occasionally as suppositories, because of course, it became the pharmaceutical equivalent of saying, "Shoo, don't worry about it." Naturally, it found a home in the temple medicine cabinet, that sacred shelf where healing met holy mystery. Priests, doubling as physicians, administered it during rituals and serious treatments, probably while saying things like, "This will ease the divine tension in your spleen." Whether your god was angry or your hemorrhoids were, opium could calm them both. The ancient texts don't call it opium directly. Of course, that would be too helpful. They reference extracts from the poppy plant in the same vague way modern labels say natural flavors, which is never comforting. But let's not pretend this was all medicinal. And let's not forget the classism baked into every powdered pore. Noble women wanted their skin to look untouched by sunlight or hardship, so the paler the better, even if it made them anemic, delirious, or eventually dead. Looking divine came at a divine cost. But perhaps the most ironic part is that the women who could afford all this toxic luxury also had access to imported perfumes from the Orient, rose water distillations, and camphor lace tonics. They literally smelled like angels while their skin peeled off in sheets. If you had a functioning pair of eyebrows in Renaissance Florence, you clearly weren't trying hard enough. In the never-ending quest to resemble a bottle painting or a particularly fashionable egg, Renaissance women plucked their hairlines and eyebrows into oblivion. A high, rounded forehead was considered the epitome of beauty. The higher your forehead, the more noble and intelligent you appeared. So, women willingly yanked out rows of hair from their brows and along their hairline with tweezers, rough cloth, or even seashells. This wasn't a one-time affair. It was routine maintenance, a weekly ritual of pain and precision. For stubborn hairs, women rubbed in concoctions made from walnut oil or cat dung. Yes, cat dung to thin the regrowth. Some even scorch stray hairs off with candle flames, because nothing says grace and refinement like lighting your face on fire. Eyebrows thin, arched, and barely visible, if at all. A truly sophisticated woman had no visible brows. Instead, a soft shadow or trace was painted in later, often with burnt cork or powdered charcoal, which sounds elegant until you realize it's smeared terribly in the Florentine heat. Imagine your eyebrows slowly dripping down your cheeks during Mass. Divine. Meanwhile, body hair was seen as animalistic and unclean. Women removed it with a paste made from vinegar, quicklime, and arsenic, another charming blend. The lead-based ceruse makeup had to be gently removed, not because it was delicate, but because scrubbing too hard would literally take your skin with it. Many women used a mix of almond oil and vinegar to dissolve the layers, hoping that their complexion underneath wasn't too ravaged. Spoiler, it usually was. Then came the hair, or what was left of it. Carefully, the pins and fake braids were uncoiled. Any adhesive used to keep forehead wigs securely in place had to be dissolved with herbal tonics. Ladies hoped that the cat dung and quicklime they had used for hair removal earlier in the week hadn't left any bald patches. No pressure. Take the koi fish, for example. It wasn't just decorative. A koi swimming upstream represented strength, determination, and the willingness to face impossible odds. According to legend, a koi that reached the top of the waterfall became a dragon. It was the perfect metaphor for a man trying to climb his way out of the lower classes to prove something the world refused to see. Dragons were everywhere, but they weren't the fire-breathing monsters of Western myth. They were protectors, spiritual guardians, powerful, wise, and deeply tied to the forces of nature. A dragon coiling across the back wasn't meant to intimidate. It was meant to shield, a constant unseen presence between your skin and the world. Peonies symbolized bravery with a touch of elegance. Tigers stood for ferocity and resolve. Waves meant life's unpredictability. Demons and ghosts were warnings, cautionary tales inked into the flesh as reminders of the dangers lurking in both the physical and spiritual world. Many tattoos depicted full scenes from Chinese and Japanese folklore, battles, betrayals, divine interventions. Popular subjects included the Suikoden, a Chinese epic about 108 outlaw heroes. These stories resonated with the tattooed class. Rebels, protectors, misfits who didn't quite fit into the samurai ideal but still lived by a code. Buddhist deities were common, too, particularly the wrathful ones. Figures like Fudo Myoho, the immovable protector, with a sword in one hand and a rope in the other, bound demons and cut through ignorance. Having him tattooed on your back was like carrying a spiritual bodyguard, one who didn't mind getting violent when necessary. But not all meanings were universal. A tattoo's placement, size, and direction all mattered. A tiger climbing upward might mean ambition. Downward could suggest a warning. Even the order of when each section was tattooed said something about your journey. These symbols were sacred, private, and powerful. They often acted as literary couriers, borrowing, copying, and circulating books under the guise of devotional reading. One nun in Naples reportedly kept a copy of The Perfumed Garden behind her copy of Lives of the Saints. Censorship may have prevailed publicly, but in private, Renaissance readers simply turned the page more carefully. Behind convent walls, far from the judgmental eyes of society and the ever-present index of forbidden books, Renaissance nuns had access to their own libraries, and some of them were anything but holy. While convents were often perceived as bastions of chastity and devotion, the reality was more complex. They were also centers of literacy, intellectual curiosity, and, yes, suppressed desire. Many young women entered religious life not by choice but due to family arrangements. If they were too expensive to marry off, they were sent to the nuns. If they were too outspoken, they were cloistered. This resulted in a generation of women who were highly educated, forcibly celibate, and desperately bored, entering the convent library. On the surface, these collections were pious and respectable, containing saints' lives, theological commentaries, and devotional poetry. However, a closer examination would reveal marginalia scrawled in the corners, entire passages underlined with suspicious enthusiasm, and, in some cases, handwritten copies of forbidden love poetry tucked discreetly between prayer books. One nun in Ferrara was famously reprimanded for translating Ovid's Amores into the vernacular, allegedly for educational purposes. Others wrote their own verses, coded, melancholic, and often filled with longing. Scholars today suspect that some of the most passionate Renaissance sonnets attributed to anonymous courtly ladies were actually penned by cloistered women, using writing as a form of romantic escape. And it wasn't just poetry. There's always a blurry line between spiritual elevation and a really good nap. And for elite Egyptians, especially those being embalmed, opium might have been part of the final send-off. What better way to face the underworld than totally blissed out and blissfully unaware of the scarab beetle crawling across your nose? Like many of Egypt's sacred substances, opium was part cure, part comfort, and part controlled chaos. Used wisely, it soothed agony. Used poorly, it turned temple assistants into spaced-out background dancers. Still, in a world of tooth drills, snakes, and sandstorms, a little somnolent magic went a long way. Wine in ancient Egypt was a sign of sophistication, a drink of the gods, a toast to Osiris. But don't let the elegant amphory fool you. This stuff could hit like a chariot accident, especially when it came laced with the ancient equivalent of a little something extra. Wines weren't just fermented grape juice. They were infusions, concoctions, and occasionally mild experiments in altered consciousness. Egyptians flavored their wine with everything from mandrake and blue lotus to myrrh and frankincense, ingredients that sound spiritual until you realize they were probably added for maximum mood enhancement. Religious festivals were the main setting for these potent potables. At the Feast of Drunkenness, for example, participants didn't sip wine to appreciate terroir. They chugged it to achieve metaphysical disconnection. The idea wasn't to be tipsy. It was to teeter between dimensions, possibly while dancing with a priest in a leopard skin. These spiked brews were often described in medical texts as remedies, which is how you know things were getting creative. Got a headache? Try a wine infused with fermented lotus. Sore joints? How about some frankincense-infused red, aged 2 weeks in a clay pot? Existential dread? Well, that one needed priestly supervision and possibly a floor mat. And it wasn't just mortals enjoying this liquid therapy. The mixture burned, but hey, it left the skin smooth. Until it didn't. And the scalp? Hair was gathered up into tight, rigid styles, often braided and padded with false hair made from wool, horsehair, or someone else's actual hair. Sometimes hairpieces were soaked in lye and bleached to match the fashionable golden hue of the season. If it didn't match, no worries. Just wear a cap over it and pretend it did. Renaissance problem-solving at its finest. And in a society where words could betray you, tattoos became the most honest form of expression. As the Edo period progressed, the vibrant underground culture of Irizumi, once a secret code of honor among laborers, firemen, and gamblers, began to collide head-on with shifting social attitudes and rising paranoia from the ruling class. What was once admired in hidden bathhouses and teahouses slowly became associated with crime, deviance, and dishonor. The turning point came when the government began tightening its grip on public behavior. Tattooing, already unofficially frowned upon, started to take on a more dangerous reputation, especially as it became more visible among the bakudo, or gamblers, and other criminal groups who would eventually give rise to the modern yakuza. These men were often the only ones bold enough to wear full bodysuits openly, and as they became more organized, so did the stigma attached to their ink. Ironically, many of these same criminals had begun as outcasts from society, men who wore tattoos not to provoke fear, but to reclaim identity. But once crime syndicates began using tattoos to mark membership, territory, and loyalty, public perception shifted. The police didn't care whether your dragon symbolized courage or your koi fish meant perseverance. To them, tattoos now signaled one thing: criminality. Some convents possessed copies of anatomical treatises, ostensibly for medical knowledge, as nuns often served as nurses. But as we've already established, anatomy books were rarely just about medicine. One abbess in Florence even petitioned to keep her convent's illustrated anatomy manual, arguing that it helped the younger sisters understand temptation, which was a rather creative interpretation. Naturally, the church attempted to regulate what was read within those walls, But literacy empowered autonomy, and autonomy led to subversion. Forbidden texts circulated quietly between trusted hands. Pages were memorized, copied, and passed along with coded bookmarks. The scent of ink and vellum became more intoxicating than incense for some. In the silence of the evening, after Vespers and confession, a young nun might light a candle and open a worn book, not of scripture, but of something warmer. A poem, a story, or a stolen fragment of a world she could never touch but could still imagine. Because sometimes the most forbidden books weren't about lust. They were about freedom. Not all forbidden books were kept in libraries or chained to monastery shelves. Some were hidden in aprons, buried under floorboards, or whispered from memory in back alley markets. These weren't printed by respected presses or debated in salons. These were the other Renaissance texts, the magical ones. Handwritten grimoires, herb manuals, and charm books passed between midwives, herbalists, and women who certainly weren't calling themselves witches, but everyone else was. Love was power, and power, particularly when wielded by a woman, was dangerous. That's why love spells were among the most feared and popular forms of forbidden knowledge. Renaissance charm books often contained instructions on how to win affection, induce obsession, or rekindle a fading marriage, using ingredients like a strand of hair, a cup of wine, or a muttered phrase beneath the full moon. The gods themselves were believed to appreciate a good spiked offering. Vats of wine were ritually poured out in temples, left as offerings in tombs, and used in ceremonies to help the divine descend into statues, or at least wobble in their general direction. Let's be clear, this wasn't your average table wine. Depending on the additives, these sacred brews could calm nerves, ease pain, or launch a midsummer banquet into full-on psychedelic mystery cult territory. And because everything was part of a ritual, no one could really question the dosage. If the room spun, it was spiritual. If you passed out in the lotus garden, that was divine communion. For the ancient Egyptians, wine wasn't just a beverage. It was a vehicle, one that could take you to enlightenment, to sleep, or into the arms of a very confused crocodile god. For a civilization obsessed with order, ritual, and geometry, the ancient Egyptians had a surprisingly open mind about trance states. In fact, they encouraged them, just not during accounting. These altered mental states were seen as direct channels to the divine, or at least to some deeply theatrical inner monologue. Possession, divine, not demonic, was often treated as a religious promotion, not a medical emergency. If a temple dancer started convulsing mid-rhyme, she wasn't rushed out by worried acolytes. She was applauded. Hathor had arrived, apparently, and had strong opinions about tambourine tempo. These trances were often achieved through a time-honored combo of repetitive drumming, rhythmic chanting, smoke inhalation, sleep deprivation, and wine with mysterious floaties in it. The result: sudden bouts of prophecy, dramatic gasping, and the occasional unplanned floor nap. This wasn't theology, it was folk science, and it worked, or at least it felt like it did. One famous spell book from southern Italy included a ritual for ensuring fidelity. Sow a pinch of dried basil into your lover's doublet, whisper their name 3 times, and sprinkle rose water on their pillow. If they dreamed of you that night, the magic had worked. If they didn't, well, there were stronger measures to take. Aphrodisiacs were another staple of these underground texts. Recipes blended Renaissance botany with medieval imagination, using ingredients like cinnamon, anise, ground oysters, and mandrake root, which were sometimes effective and sometimes toxic. One apothecary manual cheerfully recommended a mixture of honey, wine, and powdered stag antler to ignite the fires of Venus, conveniently omitting the risk of violent nosebleeds. Men were curious, but women were the primary readers and keepers of these texts. Many passed recipes and rituals from mother to daughter, particularly in rural areas where priests visited infrequently and midwives handled everything from childbirth to heartbreak. But owning such a book was a gamble. The Inquisition frowned upon women with too much knowledge, and a love spell was simply a witch trial waiting to happen. Therefore, pages were hidden, burned, or disguised as herbal journals. You could be an herbalist on Tuesday and a heretic by Thursday, depending on what someone saw or imagined. By the late Renaissance, the printing press had revolutionized everything. Books were no longer handcrafted treasures for the elite. They were commodities. And while Gutenberg may have started with Bibles, printers soon discovered a far more lucrative market: desire. Venice became the epicenter of this quiet revolution, boasting the perfect blend of wealth, lenient censorship, and a healthy appetite for vice. Concealed behind religious tracts and scholarly commentaries, small, privately circulated books began to emerge, books that made no pretense about their contents. They didn't claim to be anatomy manuals or disguise poetry as devotion. They were explicit, illustrated, and intended to shock. One of the most notorious of these was I Modi, translated as The Positions. Originally created by engraver Marcantonio Raimondi with illustrations by Giulio Romano, it depicted 16 scenes of explicit intimacy. Each engraving was accompanied by poetic verses by Pietro Aretino, whose sharp wit and even sharper tongue earned him a reputation as the Renaissance's first pornographer. Needless to say, the church was not amused. I Modi was immediately banned, plates were seized, copies were destroyed, and Raimondi was arrested, but the damage, or, depending on your perspective, the innovation, had been done. The notion that the printing press could be used for erotica had been unleashed, and it wasn't going back in the bottle. Underground presses sprang up across Europe, printing slim volumes of love poetry, scandalous tales, and sometimes outright smut. These weren't mass-produced. Copies were expensive, intended for wealthy patrons with a taste for the forbidden. Some were even commissioned privately, with content tailored to the buyer's fantasy, akin to custom Renaissance fan fiction. Printers developed clever tricks to avoid detection, using fake title pages, false publishing locations, printing in Constantinople, or Latin phrases that made the books appear to be harmless philosophy. In reality, they were often illustrated with woodcuts or copper engravings that made anatomy textbooks look tame. For the right price, you could obtain a book that thrilled, amused, or shocked without ever admitting you owned it. Many nobles kept theirs in cabinets with special keys, while some had bindings that, when shelved, resembled dictionaries or psalters. The printing press didn't just democratize knowledge, it made lust portable. And with each new title, Renaissance readers edged closer to something revolutionary: pleasure without permission. By the end of the Renaissance, the line between education, entertainment, and seduction had blurred beyond recognition. What began as anatomical curiosity or theological instruction had evolved into a secret bookshelf of longing, one that transcended gender, class, and even religious boundaries. And that's precisely what made it so dangerous. To the church, these books represented moral decay. To scholars, they were intellectual experiments. But to the people actually reading them, noble women, students, nuns, and even merchants, they were something else entirely: power. Not the kind won on a battlefield or in a courtroom, but the quieter, more subversive kind that begins in the margins of a book. In an age where women's bodies were controlled, their voices silenced, and their desires shamed, these books offered an alternative narrative, a place where love wasn't always arranged, where pleasure could be named, and where curiosity didn't have to be confessed in Latin. Whether it was a love spell hidden in an herb manual, a censored sonnet copied by hand, or a forbidden poem read by candlelight, each was a rebellion in disguise. And let's not forget the men. For all the public bravado and church-sponsored guilt, they were buying these books too. Philosophers who debated virtue by day might return home and read The Golden Ass with a glass of wine. Priests who condemned lust from the pulpit sometimes kept a copy of Ovid tucked beneath their cassocks. Human nature, after all, has always been adept at compartmentalization. The forbidden bookshelf wasn't just a Renaissance quirk. It was a reflection of a world grappling with change. The printing press had opened Pandora's box. Literacy was spreading, and ideas were becoming harder to control. And once people realized that books could evoke deep, private, even sinful feelings, there was no turning back. Most of these books didn't survive intact. They were burned, hidden, or miscatalogued. But some did. They reside today in museum vaults and rare book rooms, fragile and foxed with age, still echoing with secrets whispered across centuries. Because the Renaissance wasn't just a rebirth of art and science. It was a rebirth of desire. And between the sermons and sculptures, The forbidden books reveal everything that the marble couldn't.